Okay, welcome to your fourth lesson of Unit 8. So again, Unit 8 is all about solving quadratic equations. In the last two lessons, you learned how to solve quadratic equations by taking square roots. So you just used your inverse operations and took square roots. Now we're going to get into our second method, which is by factoring. So the good news is that if you were successful with factoring in the last unit, you're going to be able to use that same knowledge for this new type of solving quadratic equations. So for this lesson, you're going to need the packet that says Solving Quadratic Equations Part 2. So if you haven't yet downloaded that from the classwork section of Google Classroom, please go back there and download that. Again, if you have access to a printer, please print it. If not, you can just do the work on a separate sheet of paper. So you can see our learning target for this lesson says, I can solve a quadratic equation by factoring. So for your do now, it wants you to read the top of page 1 in that new packet and try to restate what the zero product property is in your own words. So right now you should be looking at this part of page 1. I'd like you to pause the video so you can read this to yourself and see if you can restate the zero product property. Okay, so after reading through this, the zero product property basically is a fancy way of saying that if I have two numbers that I'm trying to multiply together and the answer is 0, it's saying that either this number or this number here could be 0, because we know that anything times 0 just gives us an answer of 0. So today we're going to be finding the zeros or the roots or solving for x. There's lots of different ways that they can state what we're being asked to do. But our problem is going to look like what you see in this example over here, where it said to find the zeros of f of x equals x times x plus 8. So you'll notice the first thing that you should do when it says find the zeros is just set that entire function equal to 0. Because as it says here, a zero of a function is any number x that's going to make your equation equal to 0. So what you see over here is that I set x equal to 0, this part, and I set x plus 8 also equal to 0. And then I solve for x. The first equation was already solved for x, just x equals 0. But in the second equation, we had to use our inverse operations to get x equals negative 8. So there are two zeros of this function, or two numbers that make the whole function equal to 0. So we're going to be using that zero product property to solve equations by factoring. You'll notice that today we're solving by factoring when a is 1, meaning there's that invisible 1 out front or no number, and we're going to use that method of factoring to solve. So right now I would like you to pause this video. Please read through all 4 steps of example 2 and answer the 2 think, write, pair, share questions, and then come back to the video. Okay, so looking at the video here, it says, what is the first step if you want to solve a quadratic equation by factoring? And you'll notice that the first step it said right here is to write it in standard form. So for number 1, we're going to say write in standard form. And just to be clear, we mentioned this a little bit last week, standard form looks like this. It's ax squared plus bx plus c, but now we want this to be equal to 0. So in this type of factoring, the first thing you always need to do is make your equation equal to 0, basically putting everything on one side of the equation and having the other side be 0. So what they did in this example is they had to move that 21 by adding 21 to both sides, which gave them this equation right here, x squared plus 10x plus 21 equals 0. That is in standard form. Now we get into factoring. So this type of factoring here, remember we ask ourselves that key question of what are the factors of c that add to b? So what are the two numbers that multiply to 21 but also add to 10? And we see those numbers right here. We picked 3 and we picked 7. And then we set up our factoring to look just like this. Again, this is what you were doing in the last unit where you factored. But now we're going to take it a step further because we want to actually solve for x. So this brings us to question number 2. It says after they factored, how did they solve for the values of x? So after they got to this point right here, how did they solve for x? And if you notice, that's exactly what happens in step 4, which is to use what we mentioned in our do now, the zero product property. So what the zero product property tells us is that we should be setting everything equal to 0. So I'm going to say setting both factors equal to 0 and solve for x. Because again, what the zero product property tells us is that if this whole thing is equal to 0, I could have either x plus 3 be 0, or I could also have x plus 7 equals 0. And then we use our inverse operations to solve here. They subtracted 3 from both sides to get x equals -3, and they subtracted 7 from both sides to get x equals -7. So x equals -3 and x equals -7 are both solutions for this equation. So let's take a look at our guided practice. Again, at this point, I'd like you to pause the video and try to answer these two questions by yourself. Okay, so in number 1, it asked us to solve by factoring. Again, as we mentioned in the first part of the lesson here, the first thing we have to do is write our equation in standard form. Right now, this equation is not in standard form, but if I go ahead and just add that 49 over to the left side, it will be in standard form. I'm just going to bring my work over here. So right now we have x squared plus 14x plus 49 equals 0. So this is in standard form. It looks like ax squared plus bx plus c. Now I notice that this is a trinomial and there's an invisible 1 out front, so I know that I can go right to my 2 parentheses. I can start them both with an x. And then again, we are asking ourselves the question of what can we multiply by itself to give us 49 and also add to get 14. So if we think about the factors of 49, the factors of 49 that we know are 1 and 49 and 7 and 7. So the numbers that we should pick from this list are 7 and 7, because if we do 7 times 7, that gives us 49. And if we do 7 plus 7, that also gives us 14. So that means that we're going to have positive 7 and another positive 7 that fill in our 2 binomials. Now again, in the last part of the unit, we would have just stopped right here, but now we're going to use this new zero product property that we've learned because we need to actually go and solve for x. So what you're going to do at this point, I'm just going to continue my work down here, is you're going to set each binomial equal to 0, because again, either binomial could be 0 to make the whole equation 0. So I could have x plus 7 equals 0 or x plus 7 equal to 0. Now again, to solve for x, we would just use our inverse operations by subtracting x, so we get -7. And over here again, inverse operations to get -7. Now you'll notice that for number 1, we happen to get the same number twice, which really means the answer is just x minus 7, but it's okay if we write it twice. So the answer for number 1 you should have is x minus 7. Looking at number 2, it says to find the zeros of the function by factoring. So as you read in the beginning of the lesson here, when it says find the zeros, that means to set f of x equal to 0. I'm going to do my work for this problem over here. So I want you to start first by just setting the entire function that they're giving to us equal to 0. Notice that this is already in standard form, so we can go ahead and set up our 2 binomials. They're both going to start with x. And then again, we're asking ourselves the question of, let's do this down here, what times what gives us -8, that's our c, and what plus what gives us +2, because that's our b. So if we think about the factors of 8, we know there's 1 and 8, 2 and 4. So thinking from this list how I can multiply to -8 but also add to +2, I'm going to need to focus on the 4 and the 2. But in order to add to +2, I'm going to need to use a +4 and a -2. And we see that this works because 4 times -2 is -8, and 4 plus -2 is +2. So now I'll come back to my binomials and I'll fill those numbers in. One of the numbers we found was +4. The other number we found was -2. Now again, in the last part of the unit, we would have just stopped right here, but now we need to go and actually solve for x by using our zero product property. You're going to set x plus 4 equal to 0, and you're also going to set x minus 2 equal to 0. Using our inverse operations here, I'm going to subtract 4 on both sides. So I'll get x equals negative 4. And over here, our inverse operation will be to add 2. And we'll get x equals 2 as our other answer. So you'll notice for number 2, we have two different answers, or two zeros. We have x equals negative 4 and x equals positive 2. Okay, so at this point, we're ready for our checkpoint question. If you feel like you would like more problems demonstrated for you, if you go back into the classwork post, I posted some Khan Academy videos where they work out some similar problems. But at this point in our lesson, we're going to take a look at our checkpoint question. Here are your two questions. I'd like you right now to pause the video and try to answer both questions, then come back here to check your work. Okay, so at this point, you should only be coming here if you've already solved these problems to go over our answers quickly. For part A, you'll notice the equation was already in standard form, which is great. So we can go ahead right away and do our factoring. I'll start both parentheses with an x. And again, the question is what multiplies to negative 28 and adds to positive 3? Those numbers that you should have chosen were positive 7 and negative 4. Because 7 times negative 4 is negative 28, but 7 plus negative 4 was positive 3. But now again, you have to take this a step further to actually solve for x. You need to set x plus 7 equal to 0, and you need to also set x minus 4 equal to 0. Using your inverse operations, you should have had x equals negative 7 as your first answer, and x equals positive 4 as your second answer. So for part A, you should have negative 7 and positive 4. Looking at question B of your checkpoint question, notice that this equation was not in standard form. So the first thing you should have done was subtracted that 2 over to the left side to give you x squared minus x minus 2 equals 0. Now your equation is in standard form because everything is on one side with a 0 on the other side. Go ahead and set up your binomials to factor. And then again, we ask ourselves here, what multiplies to negative 2 and adds to negative 1? If you were confused there, don't forget that middle term was an invisible negative 1. The numbers that you should have chosen were negative 2 and positive 1, because negative 2 times 1 gives you negative 2, and negative 2 plus 1 gives you negative 1. Using your zero product property, you're going to set x minus 2 equal to 0, and you're also going to set x plus 1 equal to 0. Using your inverse operations, your first answer should have been positive 2. Your second answer should have been negative 1. So the two values of x for part B were x equals positive 2 and x equals negative 1. Okay, at this point of the lesson, we're getting into our independent practice. So you should be looking in the packet Solving Quadratic Equations Part 2. If you feel like you were unable to solve either of those equations and you're not really ready to tackle some more challenging problems, I'd like you to start on page 2 with numbers 1 through 6. You'll notice on those problems we've already factored it out for you, so you're just practicing using your zero product property. If you feel like you kind of understood those two problems, but maybe you didn't get them totally correct, and you just have some minor errors, I'd like you to also be on page 2, but working on numbers 7 through 12. And if you're good and you got both of those problems correct and you feel like you understand, that would put you in green. Green, you're going to start with number 13, which is on page 2, and then you work your way up through number 23 on the next page. You'll notice that all of these questions, starting with number 15, have all been on a past Regents exam, so those are some great questions for you to answer. Just to be clear, in order to get your classwork participation credit for doing this lesson, we need to see you getting through at least 2 groups worth of practice. So if you were in red, we'd like to see you doing red and yellow. If you were in yellow, we'd like to see you doing yellow and green. And if you were in green, we'd like to see you doing all of the green. and getting to those extension questions. No matter what group you're in, I want you to notice down here, these are the questions in your Regents packet right now that you know how to answer. So number 4, 7, 14, 23, 24, and 31. I would take the time at the end of this lesson to make sure you go and answer those. That way you're not saving all of your Regents packet until the end. So at this point, you should be pausing the video. Please go take about 10 to 15 minutes to work on your independent practice, and then come back here to check your answers. Okay, so if you're still watching this video, that means that you have already done your independent practice and you're ready to check your answers. Let's take a look. Here are the answers for numbers 1 through 12 on page 2. Feel free to pause the video to check your work. Okay, here's numbers 13 through 15 at the bottom of page 2. Again, go ahead and pause the video to check your work. Okay, moving on to page 3. Here's the top of page 3. And moving on to the bottom, here is the bottom of page 3. Okay, so to wrap up this lesson, you should look at the new exit ticket 8.2. At this point, you know how to do question number 1. So I would go ahead and answer that question, but again, you're not going to submit this exit ticket until you have answered all questions on the exit ticket. You'll notice that this exit ticket has 4 questions on it, so please do not submit it to us until you've done all of these 4 lessons and solved all the problems. But what I would do is answer question number 1 and just kind of keep that off to the side for you to use when you get to the next few lessons.